So once you can get out to the rest of the world, that makes a big difference. And so we've been looking at in the class here how that magic actually happens, concentrating on Ethernet rather than fiber optics and so on. Okay, so we have from Bill Morris's quote here, which is actually a quote from one of the older Nemeth texts here as to how Ethernet works. Right? Basically, it is this CSMA/CD protocol, right? In that you can tell whether or not someone is actively using the line or not by listening. And anyone who wants to talk can talk under Ethernet. Right? There's some other protocols where you have to pass around the baton, et cetera, and only the person holding the baton gets to talk, but that's not how Ethernet was set up. Right? And if two people start talking at once, two computers start talking at once, they can tell that, and then they both shut up and wait a while. Okay. Now, there's various ways you can set up these networks, and the internet is really a network of networks. And we want to see how these guys actually do get connected up. So back in the old days, we had a really thick wire, more than an inch thick essentially, and computers had little vampire taps that would go down into the core of this stuff. You would connect things up that way. And that was the original way of doing it, and you really did have to kind of like drill a little hole into the sheathing around these things. There's basically one center wire, kind of like coaxial cable, right? One center wire, a big piece of copper in there, and then a lot of plastic around that, and then an outer shielding of aluminum foil type stuff. And the idea was you had to connect to both things. So the vampire taps basically had a bit of copper here that could come down, and you had to hit pretty much the center of the wire to get a connection there. And then they had along the sides here insulation so that you didn't short circuit it with the outer layer. And then elsewhere there was the other part of the cladding that went around these wires that went down here would connect up to that. So, and the signals that are going down these wires are basically subject to interference, right? If you don't shield the cables here, you get all sorts of noise and stuff in there. Right? So in the original design there, that center wire was shielded from everything else by having the ground essentially around the outside. Now, since then, they have discovered that you can basically take two wires and twist them together, tiny little wires, to become a twisted pair. And as long as there's a sufficient number of twists in there, that sort of cancels out any interference that's coming out. You don't need the big cladding and clunky wires and things like that anymore. So if you look inside an actual Ethernet cable, there's 4 wires in there, and they're intertwined with each other, twisted up here in pairs. 4 pairs of twisted wires, and that's the current thing that we use. Right? And there's that little RJ11 switch here with 8 little guys coming in there, and each wire is connected up to one of those little 8 things, and we have jacks just like you'd use for a telephone to go on the wall, except it's got to be bigger because instead of 2 or 4 lines, we need 8 lines for this to work. Right, so that's the current set. We're up to nowadays category 6, generally called Cat 6 wire here. For quite a while it was Cat 5 that worked fairly well with this twisted pair. Except in category 5, if you make too sharp a bend, well then sort of the signal could escape essentially. Category 6, you really can tie this stuff in more or less knots, and it doesn't matter. Sharp bends are not a big problem anymore. With the newest wires. And so if you have Cat 5 wires laying around, you almost certainly want to replace them by Cat 6 to get you the best performance out of your Ethernet. All right, so simple case, we're talking about something like that, one big long wire here and a bunch of guys connected into it. Right? So in the Tannenbaum text, they have some pictures and basically looks more or less like that. And If somebody starts talking, basically the signal, the electrons head out in both directions down this wire here, and everybody will be able to listen to what's being said. And we'll see later in the protocol here that even though these guys listen to everything, unless you put your Ethernet card into what's called promiscuous mode, so that it sucks in everything out there, it only pays attention to certain packets. It'll pay attention to the broadcast packets that everybody is supposed to, suck up. And then the only other kind it pays attention to are the ones that are addressed specifically to that one Ethernet card. Okay. All right, so how the protocol itself works here, and we'll get into the details of what the software needs to do later on. But the idea is that you listen on the wire here, and you wait for a lull in the conversation. There should only be the carrier signal on the wire if no one else is talking. Right, and those will be the rules that we work with. Now, I think I mentioned last time, so I sort of skipped this paragraph here, every single card is unique around the world here. Each manufacturer has, Ethernet addresses are 6 octets long. Each individual manufacturer is assigned 3 octets. And then each of their cards, they specify the next few octets. So each company makes sure that they never duplicate any of those last 3 octets. And since different companies have different initial octets, everybody gets a different address out of that. Right, so it doesn't matter what you hook up here. You're not going to hit a bad luck situation where 2 cards think they're the same computer or something like that. They're all unique. All right. So when you transmit a message, again, it heads out both ways. You can be listening to what's on the wire there, right? And this means if somebody else starts, which could happen if 2 guys start at more or less the same time, either one knows the other one's about to talk because the electrons haven't gotten there yet. Right? The disturbance in the carrier signal hasn't shown up yet. So you listen to your message, and if it's coming through loud and clear, then you know that you've got the floor, and you can just keep talking for as long as your packet requires you to. But if you find out you can't quite understand what you're saying, that's a pretty good indication that, rather than a short in the wire or something like that, that somebody else tried talking when you wanted to talk. All right. So when that happens, what we do is we do at a dinner party. Right? Both people stop, wait a bit, and then try again. We talked last time about how we want to add some randomness into there. Because if both guys wait the exact same amount of time and start up again, it's almost certainly going to be another collision, just like there was last time. So we vary that a little bit. And if there is another collision, then we wait like twice as long with a little bit of fudge factor shown in, and try again. And keep doing that, do an exponential back-off is what it's called, until eventually somebody gets the floor without somebody else trying to interrupt them. Now, it can be a problem. But too many of these guys, 100 different things on the same length of wire here, and it's kind of a busy network. It's kind of hard to avoid those sort of delays, right? So everybody keeps waiting longer and longer and longer. Less and less traffic actually winds up going because of all of those collisions. Okay, so you have to be careful not to put too much stuff on a wire like that. Okay. All right, so that was the original way of doing it. It was kind of the only reasonable way to make things happen. Nowadays, since we have this twisted pair stuff, we can have a little hub, and you can find one of those on the tables down in, actually there's more than one in that room, but the one that we care about is on the table near some of our machines there. And they have little ports in there into which we can plug our wires. So each individual computer gets plugged into a different spot in this wire. And one of those guys goes over to like this. Okay. Now, if this had just been a hub, first thing that gets talked about here, then we'd still have basically the same situation we had here with just slightly different hardware supporting it. In a hub, if somebody sends something into the switch here, into that hub then broadcasts it on every single port that it's got. everybody hears everything. And if you do that, somewhere when you get up to where the amount of traffic that you can carry is about 70% of the maximum, then we start getting collisions and things can start going downhill. People have to wait longer and longer before they can get their messages through. But almost always, hardly anyone sells hubs anymore here. It's fairly easy because chips are only a few bucks each or whatever to make this really, really smart. And we have what's called a switch. And this is the guy, once you turn it on, is going to be listening to messages, right? And these Ethernet packets that come through, as we'll see later on in the lecture here, have an address as to not only where they're going to, but where they came from. So the switch can figure out, what the address of the card is that's down here. And there could be, it actually might not be a single host here. Maybe it's another switch, which has like 5 guys connected to it. And eventually it will remember that, hey, I have 5 different addresses that are supposed to go down this particular wire. So as time goes on, it can figure out where everybody is. And in that case, if this guy, Legolas, wants to send something to this thing, the switch says, oh, I know where he is, and he's going to send it out just that one line, not to these other guys that don't have the right addresses. So once this guy learns where things go, we can make sure that only the messages go there, not to other places. Right? So pretty much the only traffic going on this piece of wire here is stuff that's either destined to this host or headed out elsewhere. So the only possibility of the collision is when the switch wants to try to say something to this guy at the same time that this guy wants to say something back to the switch. So you can get well over 90% throughput essentially out of this under those circumstances. Right? Because it's really only 2 guys talking to each other. A little bit more than that, right? Because if you have a broadcast packet, the switch knows it's got to send it out every single port. So things that are intended for everyone. But we can drastically cut down on collisions by being a little more intelligent of how to send things. Right? No way to do that with this situation. Everybody talks to that one piece of wire. There's no intelligence in the copper itself. So the switches allow things to get a lot more bang for your buck out of Ethernet. And they're cheap things. For like 20 bucks or so if you're trying to add on wireless or other fancy things like that. Okay, so that's what's being talked about here. Now, it could be that you have a message. This guy has a message for Legolas, and it sends it up the line, but somebody else is already, the switch is already talking to Legolas, or Legolas is talking to the switch, or whatever, and I shouldn't be sending that message out here. It'll garble things up. So there's actually some memory in this stuff. It's called a store and forward protocol here. Incoming messages, if we don't have a clear line to send them out to their destination on right away, we remember them. We save them for a while. And then when the line is clear, we try to send that stuff out. So this switch actually is doing a whole bunch of stuff in there. Remembering messages, sending them along the way when it can, keeping track of where everybody is. And it's a pretty big win for a pretty cheap piece of equipment. All right. Now, we do have some limits that we put on what you can transfer. Like, you can't do an entire dictionary essentially all in one packet here. These things have to be broken up into the appropriate size chunks. So there's a limit on how big a chunk that you can send along. We also put a limit on how long the cable is, because you have to be able to anticipate a worst case scenario. One guy at one end of the cable and the other at the other end here, they start talking at once. It's going to be a while before either of them notices that there's a problem, because it takes a while for the electrons to get to where you can hear the other guy talking. And if we didn't have a limit on this, then you wouldn't really know when you could confidently go ahead with your message and not have to worry about somebody else interrupting. All the other guys' cards are presumably going to follow the protocol and not talk if they're hearing somebody else start. So that's why we put a limit on how long this thing can be. All right, and similarly, we do have a reasonable limit on how many different connections that you can put onto the wire, right? Your switches sort of have a natural limit for that. It depends on how many little ports they have coming out. It's easy to buy a switch with 20 ports for not much money at all, and that's well within the limit. Okay. All right, now, if you do want to have more things on one segment that's more than what you can really put on a segment, what the legal limit for the segment is, you can have essentially a thing called a bridge. So you can have something like this and something like this, and then have something going into a bridge, which is also connected to this guy and connected to that guy. And it also tends to be smart, essentially. So you can use something like that to hook everybody together. So that all these guys appear to be on the same network as those guys, but it really is one sort of collection of wires down here and a different collection of wires up there. And again, when you discover that something is headed for one of these guys, the switch figures out, I got to send that out through this port here. Because all the addresses of these guys here appear to be coming from this little bridge. So the switch can figure out which direction to send them. And typically up the bridge, anything that comes in one end is going to wind up going out the other end unless they're completely confused about what they're supposed to be doing. Right, so there isn't in that sense a practical limit on how many things you could put on a single network. Except, we can't go up into millions or whatever. So the internet is not just one big network connected by a bunch of bridges like this. So we have to have more complications here to be able to have hops going from one network to the next network to the next network and so on. All right. And so in that respect, it's actually useful to look at the little Tannenbaum diagram since I tend to draw things badly. And so the general state of the internet would be essentially something like this. So here's our little diagram for the little Ethernet down here. Thinking of this as sort of a hub that everything fits into, or one of those big old taps where everybody is using the vampire tap to get into the stick. Now, our router here would be something like this. So when you want to talk, these machines, Sam and Frodo or whatever, want to talk with each other, it just goes directly between the machines because it's all in the same segment. But if you want to talk to Rohan or whatever, this regional network here, let's think of that as being SDSU. You want to talk to Rohan, well, that's sitting somewhere in here. And what's going to happen to our messages if Sam wants to talk to Rohan? Well, it goes to Legolas, and then Legolas figures out which of its Ethernet cards it should send things out. If you look on the back of Legolas, there's one going to our little switch, and then there's another one going into the wall, essentially, which connects you to a, let's see, this is 130.191.50. 227.254. I had some of these numbers up on the board last time. And somewhere else in here is Rohan, right, which is 130.191.3.100. And we saw when we did a trace route here, Legolas send things to this router, and then this guy directly connects to Rohan. Sort of expected to go through a different route. Last time we found the hops were simpler than they used to be. All right. Okay, so regional networks are things like what we have here in SDSU. Right? There's a bunch of these guys all ending in .254, connecting together a lot of networks that all start with 130.191. We have different subnets, essentially, each one of which has one of these big routers, essentially, on it. And then there's a whole bunch of other machines that are on the 227 network, just like we had a whole bunch of other guys on the 10 dot network down in our lab. And SDSU has gotten so big that we've also gotten a second class B address, 246 dot something or other, whatever. And those are also intermixed with this stuff here. So we've got two class Bs working for us. And UCSD, for example, would have a similar type topology. Right? It has a way to send things across the country. For us at SCSU here, that's 130.191.1.1. That's our gateway to the outside world. And that connects somewhere to a really big router that is connected to other really big routers across the world. Right? So that's how we wind up getting out. And as I say, UCSD has a similar type arrangement. Now, other things, we can think of this guy as maybe Cox Cable. Right? And it has more than likely more than one connection to the outside world. Right? Otherwise, if one machine goes down, then all their customers are kind of offline. So they probably have various backups. But for simplicity, let's just look at this diagram. And people at their home machines here, well, if they want to talk to some other Cox customer, it gets routed up into their network and then back down the appropriate line. Right? But most of the traffic doesn't do that. Most of the traffic is going elsewhere, looking at the web page, talking to Rohan or something like that. And in that case, that traffic flows into the big machines on the internet here and eventually gets to its destination. Later on, we have to talk about how that happens, and I've got some of that written up in this file as well. All right, so there's kind of a layout of how things work. And here, in these machines here are typically things by Cisco Systems and whatever, and they're special purpose machines that do nothing but routing, and they do them blindingly fast. All right. All right, so I think I've talked about most of the stuff that I've got in the notes here. Now, surprisingly enough, if you want to just go across town to, say, UCSD here, talk to maybe their supercomputer center from Rohan or whatever, we can do a trace route to see what happens there. And 15, 20 hops is not uncommon, even though it's across town. And indeed, some of those packets might go through, say, Chicago or New York or whatever. I'm not sure any of them leave the country here, but now that can happen at times as well. All right. Now, as you'll see, the network is kind of a living thing, the internet backbone here. It makes decisions all the time about where to send your packets. If you have one message, they got broken up into a bunch of packets headed for the supercomputer center. Doesn't mean they're all going to follow that same route. The routers might route things in different ways. If one router is getting a little bit overloaded, it'll find some other way to send things and spread out the traffic as best it can. It's kind of an amazing system the way it works. So a little backbone portion that we've seen in the diagram are run by various government agencies and things like that to support the internet. And there's a connection point for, as we say, SDSU, that's 130, 191, whatever. You look up the ones for Cox Cable. And again, Cox Cable is sort of all over the country, so they have lots of different connection points for different areas of the country, of course. Right. And basically, the Cox router, the thing we were talking about there, either says, okay, this stays down here in my network, or the overwhelming amount of the time it goes elsewhere. Now, those lines to your individual houses, by the way, are asymmetric lines. We're expecting most people to be, downloading information from elsewhere. All we're sending up is little queries like, give me this web page at this address, etc. Or occasionally sending out maybe a long email message that goes up the line. But mostly it's things streaming downwards here. Okay? So their hardware is set up to allow a lot of stuff to come down the pipe, but not quite. They don't support quite as much traffic going upwards. Right? So this is why they don't want you to have like a web page on your home, not a web page, but a web server on your home machine, where the rest of the world is coming in and trying to suck things up the line, give you a little request and you send a big file upwards. So they don't want people doing that. They block a lot of the ports where you'd like normally find web service. That's port 80. Now you can try to get around that by using a higher numbered port. There's a way to tell the browsers, hey, don't use port 80, use this other port. But in general, they want to discourage that sort of activity because they can't really support things in the opposite direction very well. So they have just enough so that you can make your requests to get things coming downstream from. Yeah, by the way, that's sort of the way things like BitTorrent and whatever work. Right? People have these big files and whatever on their own home computers. And they're willing to share them with other people, but you can't just ship the entire file up there. That wouldn't work. So things like BitTorrent distribute this around, right? You try to find lots of different places that can give you tiny pieces of this file, and then each one of them can handle a small piece and send it along to whoever it is now trying to collect that version of the file. So that the algorithm they use for things like BitTorrent were based on this sort of asymmetry that we have here. And still lets you get things fairly fast, even when it's coming from what would normally be a slow connection. Tons of those slow connections to handle. All right. So generally what we do, like what Lorian does down here, is that if it isn't something that's on the .10 network, which is responsible for figuring things out, all it does is kick it upstairs to the router, and then it becomes the router's problem as to what it's supposed to do with it next. So I did a bunch of hand waving last time about how that actually works, but I've got a gruesome details here in this thing, in this little write-up. So you get a much better idea of how the protocols work and how we hop from one host to the next as we go through this. All right. So another little bit of repeat from last time. We have two major types of protocols that we use for transporting stuff here. UDP, the user datagram protocol, and TCP, the transmission control protocol. UDP is sort of like the US mail service here. You put a letter in your mailbox and you sort of hope that it gets there. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And if you do this one letter each day, you figure probably the destination is going to arrive in the correct order, but maybe not. Someone may have dropped a box of things on the floor and they only find it the following week or whatever. Right? So things could arrive out of order, or maybe just plain get lost. So if you're using UDP, it has to be things that you have some. You're responsible for dealing with the issues if something does get lost. You would have to explicitly ask for a retransmission. That's got to be part of what you program into whatever is going to use that user datagram protocol. Okay? Not so with the main workhorse of the internet, which is the transmission control protocol. So that's more likened to doing a phone conversation. Right? You dial a number, and eventually there's some ringing. What's happened is a connection has been set up, right? Various switches across the country or wherever you're going to here are giving you a dedicated line for the moment. And if the other guy picks up the other end, then your data comes back and forth reliably over that thing until one of you guys hangs up. So the same sort of thing will happen with TCP. You do an SSH connection from your home machine over to Rohan. You have a reliable connection that's going to, it appears to be a reliable connection, that's going to last throughout the entire conversation. It's still really sending individual packets. Those packets might show up out of order. But the protocol itself is responsible for saving things up and putting them back in the correct order. And if it's missing some pieces, to ask the other end to resend that particular piece and so on. So as far as you're concerned, everything is just flowing nicely and properly. But underneath the hood, they may have to ask for retransmissions. That's not SSH's headache at all. They just depend on the protocol to do this for them. Okay, I've never been used the HTTP protocol, then there'd have to be more complications within the SSH program itself to make sure things are showing up in order and so on. Okay. All right, but that's a service that gets provided by TCP, so it's used for lots of stuff. So each packet that we try to send out, the sender is going to wait to hear an acknowledgement from the other end here that they received that particular packet. These things have sequence numbers and things on them, and they are then used to make sure that we got the things that we want. So if it doesn't get an acknowledgement, it will try to send it again until eventually it will say that, yeah, I did get that and let me charge it. So. And similarly, the receiving end here, as we'll see, we'll take a given packet and look at the error correction codes and stuff in there to make sure that there wasn't some problem during the transmission. If it discovers that the checksums don't add up, then it's going to ask for a retransmission rather than acknowledging negative acknowledgement and ask for it again. So all those little things happening behind your back gives you a reliable connection. Right. So the world essentially runs these days on TCP/IP. Various educational institutions and research programs and whatever tried various other protocols, but this has been the clear winner, and this is pretty much what everybody uses nowadays. So TCP, that is transmission control protocol. IP is internet protocol. So universities around the country set this up in the 60s and 70s, essentially, with a lot of funding from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Nowadays called ARPA, to be more politically correct, but it really is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So the ARPANET morphed into the internet here as we got more and more people using it at regular universities, not just military installations and so on. Okay, now, by the way, the motivation for doing that was the military wanted to be able to still have communications, even if there were outages, like from nuclear bombs and things like that. So they wanted to have some way to automatically reroute packages to be able to route around any outages or problems that they had. And that served the entire world quite well here for just using regular commercial traffic on the internet these days. But that was the original thing. And you can pretty much bet that the U.S. does, or the military does, use the internet here, but they almost certainly have their own hardened, hidden network as well underneath all of that to handle really big emergency situations that no one really particularly knows about or can reach from the regular people. So that's just speculation, but if I were a government, that's certainly the sort of thing that I would do. And they may admit that that's far more than really would admit to. All right, with any kind of protocol that you use here, basically you want to split up the tasks so that any particular part has just a simple part to play in the overall scheme of things. So we want to distribute the various headaches we have of getting packets to where they belong to different little layers. And there was a picture of this in our notes, in fact, for those several numbers. Let's see if I can find that relatively quickly. Go over each of those here in this little All right, so what we're going to be talking about next is these particular numbers. And so we briefly looked at this picture last time as well. So now you have some good words to go along with. So things like the HTTP protocol here, which the web browsers use, SSH, you've used FTP essentially at various places. The mail program uses a simple mail transport protocol to move messages back and email messages back and forth, and so on. And those are typically TCP applications. There's various other things that really do just send datagrams along there. Some computer games just use UDP, as does DNS, which we haven't talked much about yet, but we'll get to that before the semester runs out. All right, and down below that is a transport layer using one of these two main protocols. Below that is the network layer and various, mostly IP. We also talked a little bit last time about ICMPs or redirect messages, which again most people ignore these days because they can be used to send messages in the wrong way. So bad players can convince you to send things in a different direction. And down below that is the link layer. This is the stuff that's actually going to deal with the actual hardware. Of course, at the very bottom is a glass wire or copy cables or whatever, or maybe even just radio waves. So that's the 5 layers that we're going to be talking about next. Split up the various heads. Alright, so if we're using something like SSH, for example, we don't want SSH to have to know how to talk to an Ethernet card or something like that. We want to be able to just pass some data down to a lower layer and let those other layers figure out what to do with it, where to send it, and so on, and make sure everything shows up in the proper order, as we alluded to before. Alright, so this is what we mean by sort of splitting up the headers. Wants to do queues, all the SSH guy has to say is, hey, I want to set up a connection to Rohan, for example. And typically it would just say Rohan. It doesn't need to know how to figure out that, hey, that's the address of Rohan. There are other protocols that will take care of that for us. Like the domain name service is supposed to take human readable names and turn them into internet addresses, which, as we'll see in a lower layer, eventually get turned into Ethernet addresses or fiber cable addresses or whatever. Okay. All right, so SSH doesn't know about that stuff, or how it's ever going to get there. It just hands it off to the layer down below it to accomplish the task for it. All right. So now we'll talk about what the transport layer does when it gets a request like that. But hey, I want to get a reliable connection to Rohan. Alright, so TCP is the thing that might be a really long transmission.